to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Nobody asking for
You ready? Commissioner Andrews? Here. Commissioner French? Here. Commissioner Garrison?
Here.
Commissioner Coloni?
Here.
Commissioner McNeil?
Yeah.
All present.
Well, we all know what we're here for, so we might as well start
Perfect.
right now.
Well, let me introduce myself really quickly. My name is Julie Desimoni. I'm the partner that was in charge of this examination engagement. I know I'm used to handing you a lot more stuff than is here today, but first I want to start with, we were able to complete our engagement in the scope and timing that you asked for as the board. I am going to go today, our examination report is only this little thing, and that's as big as they ever get. But I wanted to provide a lot more context for the board to make sure you understood the procedures and the processes we went through and the extensive nature into which we did our work and came to our conclusions. So I'm going to be going through a PowerPoint presentation that provides a tremendous amount of context. However, I will say, generally we do. Our goal is always to provide information ahead of board meetings. And we did not do that this time. That was on purpose. That was my sole decision to make. The reason being is that an examination report is not something we're doing all the time. And I think that it was important, just based on the variety of information I received from the board of directors, and being here tonight, that I thought it was important that we set the context, and I made sure to be able to present this to you in a fashion and have you able to answer questions together. So I did make that personal choice, or my own choice, to not bring the information to you in advance. So I'm sorry if you didn't like that, but that's the decision that was made.
No, I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks. The second thing is what I'd like to do in setting this, because I know some of you have already read through the presentation, but I'm hoping that maybe we can hold questions till the end, which is not our typical nature either, because I think by the time I get to the end of my story, I'll be able to answer a lot of your questions. Now, if you are really confused about what I'm saying, or if I'm talking too fast, which I tend to do, please go ahead and stop me, but if we could try to reserve it, because I think I'm going to answer a lot of your questions towards the end of the slide deck. I'm yours until you are done with me tonight, so after the presentation, which should last about 15 minutes, we are open for any questions that you have on both the engagement and any additional questions that you have as a board. So feel free at that time. I'm here until you don't need me to answer questions anymore. So you should have two documents in front of you right now. The first is the examination, the little tiny one, is the examination report. We'll get into that in a moment. But probably the most important document is this PowerPoint presentation, because again, it's going to set all the construct and everything that we did. We worked incredibly hard over the last 2.5, 3 weeks. Went through a tremendous amount of detail, and we want to show you and build build what we did in this examination. So what we're going to talk a little bit about, or a lot about, first is the examination report, how we went through that report and what we did, and then finally the lessons learned. We want to make sure, because that was a big piece of this for a lot of the board members, is to make sure that we identify where are the lessons at, what can be learned, how you move forward from where you are today. All right. So I thought what would be important is to truly understand what an examination is. So under our scope of services that were provided from the Board of Directors, Board of Commissioners, sorry, it says that right in front of me too. We examined the activity in the 2016 bond fund. Through the inception of the fund we had to choose a date to end because that's when the accumulation of information. We chose March 31st. We had some of the April information, but not all of it because all the overheads and payroll hadn't settled yet. So we chose March 31st as our end date. Now, this examination engagement is in accordance with attestation standards of the American Institute of CPAs. And so there's a framework, there's a level of standards, there's a level of due care and independence that is required undergoing this examination. So we had to consider our independence. We do one other thing for you, for the Board of Commissioners. We do your annual financial audit, which is also something under attestation standards that requires us to be independent. And have ascertained that we are independent in fact and in appearance. We have independent auditors and individuals throughout the organization that worked on this engagement, and every person is independent. So I thought that was important to know. I think one of the most important parts is really understanding, kind of getting our heads wrapped around what's the difference between a financial statement audit and an examination. They both are under very similar rules and constructs and rules of engagement and due care. What is extremely different from them is a financial statement, we're opining on the entirety of Clackamas River water. So we do lots of procedures over many, many areas. What an examination allows you to do is allows you to drop all the other stuff we don't care about now, right this second, we care about, but not the second. And we laser focus and dive deep into one subject matter. So we're able to get right down into something that matters and there's a concern about and really focus on that concern. You still have to apply the levels of looking at internal controls and different things, but it is an extremely deep dive into this specific area that we care about today. So I will say the examinations by far are much more intense. Because we are spending all that time and effort on essentially one thing. So a lot more intense than a regular financial statement audit that kind of spreads the intensity throughout the organization. Okay. I'm going to give you several sets of conclusions today, but I did want to start with, I didn't want to get too far into the presentation without telling you that under the 2016 bond fund activity, we did give you an unmodified, otherwise known as a clean opinion on the 2016 bond fund activity. If you will look at, and this is, again, auditor speak, it's all constructed by the AICPA, we can't change too much terminology in this, but this is essentially what that second paragraph in your report of independent accountants is telling you. It's saying, here's the framework by which you, the subject matter by which you asked us to go take a look at things, and we'll get that a little bit deeper, and here what we're saying is that we don't believe there's any material modifications to it. Now, I could leave it at that, but I don't think that tells the Board of Commissioners exactly what level of depth that we went into. So what I'm using the rest of this presentation for is to give you the facts of what we did and what we found during the course of that engagement. And I'll get to the second schedule in just a few moments. So again, unmodified opinion at the end of this engagement. So here's how we started this examination procedures. We started by setting the scope with the Board of Commissioners. So that was what we all came to the terms and conditions of. And I'm going to go into a little bit deeper into what the scope was. But we set the scope with the attorney and with the Board of Commissioners to tell us what is the specific subject matter that we need to go after and have a very complete understanding of in these procedures. To do that, we not only talked with the attorney, we not only heard your board meeting, but we interviewed every single one, or actually I should say I interviewed every single one of you, some in person, some on the phone, some one time, some a couple of times. But we interviewed every single board member to identify what the specific concerns of the engagement. That led us to making sure our procedures were complete, where we tried our absolute best to make sure that we're going to address the concerns of the board as a whole. But we needed to understand what each individual's lens to see through was, because that's what we're doing, is we're shifting a lens and we're going deep with that lens. Then we had to determine what's the right team to put in play from Moss Adams. We were able to set our team. We had 2 individuals besides myself out here for close to a week, where we were we were on site just going through a tremendous amount of information and details. Those 2 individuals, I will say this wasn't planned this way. They're both in the utility group, under my group. They both have had experience with both job costing, work order accounting, and water utilities, but neither of them have been on CRW before. So it was a fresh set of eyes, I will say from that, but one that has experienced eyes within it. Then the next piece was to really obtain and verify our populations. How do we know what we're looking at is the right thing we need to look at to address the concerns the Board of Commissioners had? And that gets through this second page on this report. So again, we started February 4th, if you'll notice the second page, 2016, that's the day the bond indenture or the bond offering statement was signed. So that was the date that they came out with the bond indenture. But the way that CRW in every district and fund accounting works, you have the bond fund over here that has the cash, and then you have a construction fund that has all the expenditures that relate and can be paid by either the bond fund or by other sources of cash. So what we have here, and technically at the very start of this project, we were really just looking, the concern was really over that bond fund, because that bond fund set a budget that then is being exceeded, which we all know. So the very first, and you might question this 23 million, this is actually from the indenture of trust, where 23 million was required of the bond. You got a little bit more than that, but that was the piece that was required to be put in the bond fund. I think you did put a little bit more into it because some of the costs didn't come on the bonds, but ultimately the 23 million was set by the bond fund. To date, $17.8 million, or sorry, as of March 31st, $17.8 million had been moved out of that bond fund, expended out of that bond fund, leaving us with $5.1 million. Now, we could set our population there, but that would be really difficult. So what we did is we chose to say, nope, our real focus is going to be sitting in that construction fund. So we know we want a population of absolutely everything that happened and everything that's been looked at, and then we want to make sure that all those expenses are appropriate to be able to use bond fund dollars on. So that's where the 21 million. So that's your total construction fund as of 3/31. But only 17.8 million was used out of the bond fund, and some of that's a timing difference too, the transfer timing. So that's where we verified our populations, made sure we had the right thing. And then generally what you see on some of these things is sampling. Well, we didn't want to sample. And the reason that we want, oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. I am getting ahead, whoa, now I'm getting really ahead of myself. Apparently I don't know how to do this. Let me hold that thought, I'll get there. Yep, okay. I thought it would be interesting, so in the scope of what you asked us to do, there were two things that were really specific, and I thought I would bring those up to you. The first was, did we expend these funds? Is what we did in accordance with the bond agreement? Can we use the bond funds for what we did in the project? This comes directly from your official statement dated February 4th, 2016. The project funds are issued to finance the project, so the project being a pretty large term, under the purpose of the official statement between Clackamas River Water and Wells Fargo Bank. So then we had to go even further detail and say, well, what does that bond document say the project is? And very specifically, it outlines the project. It's defined as capital improvements to the district's facilities for the terms of the debt section in the official statement. Now, I will say that there were definitely references to some of the phasing of the projects. They were very widespread, but when it says what can you use these projects for, or these funds for, it is specific to the capital improvements to the district's facilities. Yes, sir.
By widespread, do you mean broad or general?
Broad. Sorry, broad.
Thank you.
Talked about new reservoirs, they talked about new lines, not specifically, very, very broad. Thank you. But the second thing that was important to the board during the course of setting the scope was that we take into consideration not just what the bond says, but we take into consideration the district's written, and we are very specific to written because that's what we can go back and test to. They're written administrative, financial, and board policies. And the reason that we included up on the screen the local contract review board rules is specific because that is the most direct policy that has an impact on everything that we looked at in the construction fund, right? So we did take that into consideration when we dealt with planning and performing our procedures. So then we have to start start, sort of like an audit, we have to start with internal controls. We need to see if we can see any weaknesses in the internal controls that we could potentially have to shift how we do our final testing. So we did gain an understanding of the design and implementation of controls over the bond fund, including how contracts are approved, including with the board, how those costs are monitored and the costs are approved. I mean, once the contracts are approved, then we've got to approve the individual invoices. And then we because this is of direct concern with the board, we specifically looked at how does that loop back into a board reporting framework. So we kind of had those two pieces. You know, first, were they approved? Everything looking okay? Was it a appropriate type of cost? And then we flipped over to, okay, how does it look from a board perspective? So those were in consideration for internal controls. Then after we were done with that, we got into the real brunt of the work. And this is where the sampling comment was going to come from. Generally, you take a population under audit methodology and examination methodology and you sample. We didn't want to do that. We wanted to make sure that we had an incredibly large population that we were going to look at. Two, we didn't really want to, in this instance, give anybody a lot of extra time and attention to be able to look at the documents before us. So we requested that all of the documents, all the contract files, the design files, we didn't want anything gone through before us. We said, well, put them in a room. We ended up at the operations center. Put them in a room, and we'll go through and figure out what we want to do from that standpoint. Took us about a day to figure that out, and getting through all the design files and getting through everything. You should have seen the mountain of information that was just sitting on a table ready for us. What came out of that testing is that we tested about a little over 91% of the total costs incurred with the construction fund, right? The construction fund. We did limit this to phase one. There were a smattering of phase two costs, very small in nature, but just because phase two really, the bond fund was, we just didn't look at those. So this is really to the phase one costing. I think it was under $50,000. It was really small what was sitting in phase two, so we focused on phase one. And in fact, when we look at that, if we look back over this, the $17.8 million that was drawn off of the fund so far as of March 31st, we tested over 100% of those costs. So we tested somewhere in the realm of almost $19 million of total costs. So we asked for the entire population, we got it. We went from looking at files to looking at the activity and back and forth from that. Here's what we tested for specifically. We tested all significant contracts. So all of every phase of this project, so phase one, every project within phase one, pretty much had two major contracts, your construction and your engineering contracts. So those were all caught, primarily to get the scope, the size of those. We ensured that every one of those contracts had the appropriate board approval, which they did. We ensured that every type of cost, so once you take those contracting costs off the top, there's a lot of smattering of different. There's contracts with, there's a board contract in there. There is payroll that's coming in, there's overheads that are coming in, there's certain journal entries that are hitting that construction account. There is other contracts, very few, but other contracts within there. There's land deals within there. So what we wanted to make sure that we did is once we tested the big contracts, we took them kind of out of the play and then we started playing with the remaining population. We wanted to make sure we hit every type of cost that was in there and hit those types of costs multiple times. Overlaying this entire thing, we performed tests to determine if there's any non-compliance, which we found no non-compliance. And we also considered fraud as a part of our procedures. And let me tell you what we did with that. So, for example, once we were done taking some of the big stuff that we tested to death, all done, we started taking the rest of the population, and one of the first things we saw was a petty cash charge for $50. Not very big, doesn't help us on the percentage to get to 92 or 94 or whatever. But what it did was it looked kind of interesting. Why would we be using petty cash for this type of thing? So we looked for those types of issues. That petty cash was actually due for a meeting facility, so it was due to the Grange, you had to pay $50 to the Grange for a meeting facility at the very beginning of the project to get project awareness out. We dug all the way to that. We dug to who's approving it. Is it okay? Is it something that should be in the construction fund? Those were always the questions that came back to us when we tested for. We even took it one step further. We took all of your personnel costs that got into your construction fund, and we detail tested personnel to make sure, yes, we've got timesheets, we got approvals, we got all the stuff you should, but we looked at them and said, are these all the right type of people that should be on this? Does anybody not make sense? Who's sitting in this that's charging time? I think I already talked about our journal entries. Whenever we saw a journal entries are just moving things from a financial perspective. Well, why are journal entries? We wanted to understand the business, the scope, the complete understanding of what was going on with those costs. There were a few credit balances thrown in there. So things like refunds or something different. And I know that doesn't help us as far as getting to our testing threshold, but we wanted to understand the nature of those types of or types of credit balances, so we dug into those. And then finally, we dug into some of the smaller contracts. There again, were not very many of them, but we dug into the smaller contracts to make sure that one, they were appropriate inside of the local contract review board, and to make sure that we were comfortable with what they are. So that ends us up, about Friday at about noon. And this is where it was kind of, I think our team got really excited about this. So we get up at Friday at noon. We were probably about 87, so we were to the threshold that I was comfortable to give you an opinion on our examination report. So I could, based on all of the evidence that was in front of us, based on our fraud application, we were fine. But we had money, left in the budget. So we had a half a day. So I told the team, I said, you know what, you guys, have fun. Figure out what you want to do. Ask questions that you don't, start just delving into it. Think outside the box and just ask a lot of questions. By that time, we had already knocked out the big costs. So everything that they were doing was in small dollar increments, but I think it was a real powerful for what we were trying to accomplish. So we dug even further, and at the end of that day, got to exceeding our 91% threshold in total costs. And got to an incredibly comfortable place to be able to come to you today. So here's our conclusions from the test of the details, that we believe the contracts were appropriately approved in accordance with the LCRB. You have agreed that, we have copies of it, we know when it has been changed and modified, we made sure that if it's been changed and modified in the period of time to which we were doing the procedures that we were under the LCRB. All the invoices were appropriately approved in the level and the authority of the approval limits. Change orders came up multiple times in the conversations with the Board of Commissioners. So we took it one step further and took a look at every change order. We went through every single construction contract and engineering contract and pulled every change order through the 331 period. And we have noted that all change orders were approved by the general manager, which is in accordance with the LCRB. So he's got a 15% threshold. We also noted that those change orders, and we've got a conversation or a slide on this a little bit later, but all those change orders were brought to the board of directors, but not necessarily in dollar form until final acceptance, and we'll talk about that in just a second as far as recommendations. And I think a very important fact, all costs were in accordance with the bond official statement dated February 4th, 2016. And I will even say, in our tested details, so I know the board knows of the lead contract, and we were scraping the pod trying to find something. So he got pulled a couple of times because his name kept coming up as a personal name, which makes sense because that's what the contract's under. So his name kept coming up, so we pulled a couple of those. We thought we had something when we saw first class airfare. No, it's not. First class airfare, and then we found all the documentation to where he did fly first class for a trip to San Francisco, but that was completely backed out, and the only thing that was reimbursed was general airfare in accordance with your policies and procedures. Same with tipping, same with if alcohol was bought during any of these trips, all of it was backed out in accordance with your requirements. and district policies, and state policies. Requirements, I guess.
By backed out, you mean not reimbursed?
Not reimbursed, thank you. Not reimbursed appropriately. So now we come to, so we're at the point now to say, okay, we've done the work, we've done the detail, we know what's going on. But obviously, we're not here today because everything felt right. So I think it's really important for us to step back and say, what are the observations, recommendations, and lessons learned coming out of this process? I think probably this slide is probably the most important. If anything I put in here, this slide is probably the most important. Is how information came out to the board of directors. Commissioners, sorry. How it came back up. We believe that the board reporting roll-up, including project life reporting, needs some clarity. One of the things that we found time after time, and actually we started getting confused about, was in everybody's mind, what measurement are we trying to go to? So the word budget was used in multiple instances, many instances. The word estimate was used in multiple instances. And it got hard to ascertain exactly what instance we're looking for. So there were several times in board minutes, and this was through a couple of conversations I had with board of directors, or board of commissioners, but there were several times when we were looking in the minutes to where when we started looking back the actual dollars, so when management was reporting on something and said estimate or budget, they were talking about the post-engineering estimate or budget, once you were able to track those numbers all the way back. But that's not what the board, it was very unclear. And there were several members of the board that thought it was to the pre-design or what was sent in the bond document. So that needs a whole lot of clarity to make sure when are we gonna do these estimates and what's the clarity of what we're reporting to or what management will be reporting to so that the board has a very clear understanding, because that was incredibly obvious when we met with everybody. Because I did ask about estimates, which what estimates? I mean, it was just, the clarity was not there. We recommend project life reporting at the top level. And what I mean by that is that, this project's massive. And this project has changed with time. But as you got into, when you've got phase one and then you list all the projects, a lot of the reporting disaggregated into those individual projects, right? You lost the forest through the trees. Did I say that right? Lost the forest through trees. Got so focused on the detailed projects and getting those to completion that we forgot to go back up on top and say what was our original expectation and where are we at. So that finally came to you in February, but it was extremely late in the process because we got so looking at the trees.
By original expectation, do you mean the original budget
What was put in the consideration for the bond funds.
And you're saying we did not look back at those?
No. They were, once we got into the minutes.
Yes, we did not?
Yes, we did not.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, we did not. When we were taught, when the minutes started talking to estimates, see, you're having to clarify right now too, because it's total terminology. So when those started talking to estimates, it was really the post-design estimates, which in some cases were incredibly close to the pre-design. Like, you know how to put water mains in the ground very, very well, and those estimates were right on, or pretty darn close. But when you start talking about reservoirs, and this actually gets into my second point, when you start talking about reservoirs of something you haven't done as often, the pre-design estimates, it was really interesting as we were looking through a lot of different things. The pre-design estimates, so the pre-design is what was in the bond, what the bond went out for. The contingency value was exactly the same regardless of the type of project, right? Again, you know how to put water mains in. You've had a lot of experience with that. So let's flash back to, or go back to 2015. You had a lot of experience. So yeah, can you nail that? Is that a pretty good estimate? Yeah. And a 30% contingency, does that feel pretty good? Yeah, from a construction standpoint. But you also are moving into brand new territory. And in that brand new territory, there was no differences or consideration giving that, hey, maybe these numbers might be more volatile than we expect, right? So it's very important as you move into phase two for the board, and this is my opinion, it's very important that you distinguish between what type of estimates or budgets are coming to you. Where are they in the life cycle of estimation? So when we look at the life cycle of estimation, anything further out, the further out you get, the less accurate you get. As you get into engineering, you have more information, we get better with it. You know, as you get through the life cycle stages. And I think that's where a lot of confusion happened, is that there was this life cycle, but it was never brought up as such to the board.
If we have held those original budget estimates throughout the whole reporting period in a column,
Mm-hmm.
then the difference would have shown up regularly?
Yes.
But we didn't have that.
No, it was not all, you had it in you wouldn't believe how much we had to look for all the pieces. So you had the pieces, I will say, you had the pieces, but you didn't have the pieces put together.
Right.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So I think it's important when you're going through this, just for a future, you know, if you decide to go out for bonding, which I would guess that would be the direction, though I can't tell you which way to go. But I would guess that'd be the direction, that we really understand what does this number mean in the life cycle or phase of the estimation. Because that will tell you how much you can hold it accountable, right? You know, when you get into post-engineering phase design, that's a more, I would say, accountable number than something in a real phase.
By accountable, you mean that's what we need to pay?
Well, that is what you start holding the project accountable to. Not
Oh,
what you
okay,
need to pay.
okay, got it.
Thank you. You're actually, it's a perfect question. You got me to my third point, change orders. There was a lot of concern about change orders. So I will say, so we only looked at cost through 331 because we had to finish this at some point and report back to you. At 331, we've been through every one of your change orders. Of the entire project cost, there's only about 2.5% of change orders of the total cost. Now, I will say, I would expect as you're finishing up some of your significant projects, that it's going to increase from there. But what's important is really understanding the charge of the change orders, and really then coming back and saying, what do you as a board need information from management on change orders? Because the reality of change orders is, one, they're going to occur. You have written into your contracts that change orders are okay to occur. There's different types of change orders. There's volumetrics. So many of your change orders were volumetric in nature. You didn't know how much gravel was going to be needed for a specific site. You didn't know, when you put in a main, you didn't know what kind of digging was going to be necessary, because we don't know what kind of boulders we're going to find, right? So the contractor, in the contractor's way, quite okay, says, hey, these are the things that are kind of unknown, so we're going to go from a volumetric nature. So we can give you what we're estimating, and we can give you what the volume and agree on a price. But once we get into the project and figure out what's real, that's when we'll give you the actual. So we saw many of the change orders were volumetric in nature and written into the contract. Number two, it's very difficult to get numbers because change orders on these large construction and engineering projects, we found that they don't like to they'll tell you there's going to be changes, but they're not going to quite give you numbers, because hopefully, you know, if you have an extra cost here, you might be able to make it up here, you know. And so it's not until the end of the contract where they start settling out. So that's not 100% of the time, but that's generally. So the fact of change orders being able to tell early on in the project is very difficult. So our recommendation is to you is, what do you want to know as a board? What kind of information do you want on change orders? Because we could put another column in this graph that says change orders, but the likelihood of you getting those right at the end is incredibly high just by the nature of a construction contract, right? We did dig into all of these change orders, and I will say that the Board of Commissioners was made aware of all of the change orders, just not dollar amounts because of the nature. So once the dollar amounts are known, when you get into your side of it is usually in the final acceptance of the project. However, stepping back, and saying the whole scope of this, none of those change orders have even gotten close to hitting at the 15% threshold. So they've all been approved by the general manager in accordance with your policies. So here's our conclusion, and I'm wide open for any questions. You know, there is definitely, reporting would benefit from additional clarity. And just sitting down, I think the board should have a session, especially when you're walking into phase one, which there's a lot of construction dollars still to go in phase one, and then moving into phase two about what type of information and how it should be delivered to you. And then everybody being incredibly clear on what we're trying to, what we're being held accountable to and how the information should flow. However, in saying that, our opinion is that your contracts were approved appropriately, and the ones that should have come to the board did come to the board appropriately. That costs have been appropriately approved by the general areas or the specific areas in accordance with your policies, and that your bond funds have been used appropriately as of March 31st. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, yes.
I know that this little report was probably, this is why I didn't give it to you first, it's a little, like, oh. I hope that what I gave you as far as context and information gives you a better idea of all the work that we went through and the man hours we put on this.
Well, I appreciate your time and effort in doing this. Albeit maybe not under the best of circumstances, but this is what we needed, and it's clarified a lot of things, and I think you did a really good job, and I appreciate you and your team to let them know that.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely.
But that leaves us with some things that we need to discuss.
Yeah.
Because there were a lot of questions in here, or things that where we didn't ask questions when we should have. And we should have been doing that all along. And I think that's up to us to make that decision and determine what it is we need to do. But I appreciate your work. Any questions? Anything else? Anybody?
I know it's not within the scope of your report, but what I saw, and maybe you saw it, was that the way that the cost and additional expenditures required were or will be covered was largely due to a very prudent reserve fund and reserve policies on the part of the
Prior boards.
board and, yeah, and the general manager. Thank you.
So,
Anyone else?
in your conclusion, then, it isn't so much that we went over, but that we should have been reported to in a more efficient way.
I think there's two things. Number one, I think that the pre-design estimate, I don't know if there's a sufficient amount of weight saying, hey, this is really early. Like, we're throwing it out there. We're gonna be conservative in nature, and I believe it was conservative in nature. And it is really, I mean, it was prior to even designing the system. But along the way, things changed. I mean, we're talking 5 years down the road. In fact, we were looking at it, there was one change order that's coming through, that I think I can't remember if it hit 331 or just after. But you have a change order for a steel tariff that was put in place. Trump wasn't even our president back in 2015. All the tariff stuff that's going on in the world right now, and every one of your construction contracts has language in it by the contractors that say, hey, if it's out of our control, you're gonna have to pay for it, which is a prudent business decision on their side. So there's some of that. You've changed the system. With the design, if you put the map over what was designed to begin with, you have a different system today. There was a master plan that was accepted. The plan is very good, so I think it's a couple of things. It was just the level of awareness that that was a budget back then, but may not be the total project costs. And then just exactly, as the thresholds went through, you got so stuck in the forest, but you didn't get, I said it wrong way. You got so stuck in the trees that there was no way, they didn't come back out to the forest until what felt like very late in the.
Isn't that what got lost in the process? We had an initial budget, and then we had the project costs as we went along, and we never put the two side by side.
Yes. And even when you did, there was estimates talked about throughout your board, so every time a project, so you got phase one, project two. Then once post-engineering happened, once the post-engineering, a new estimate was designed.
Right.
Right, that never
But you
got
can't-
reconciled back to the first one, and explained as to what were the differences.
Right.
And the master plan has still not been accepted by this board.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Oh, but I have to think of how I'm phrase if we had known earlier, or the reporting had been more accurate in terms of the total picture, would that have changed anything? Or would it just be that we would be more aware of it going forward? I'm not really, I guess that's my big question.
Let me ask this question. If that had happened, would the supplementary budgets that we have required not be a surprise to us
That's a
In the
better-
current year.
in the current year?
That's a better way of putting it, yes, thank you.
So yeah, the first question's hard for me to say because I don't know what the board would have decided where you want this project to go. Yeah, I think if it had come up, and then you would have had, you might have made,
We would have said, we're gonna need to put more money here.
right.
Yeah.
And where is that gonna come from? I don't know what solutions you would have come, I don't know if that would have brought you back into the lending market earlier. I don't know whether it would have, you just don't know.
It would have taken the element of surprise out of
That-
the whole
no.
matter.
Right, okay.
Well, that's the whole problem, that's why we're here,
Yeah,
The intent of
because
this,
we weren't aware of it.
the intent of this project was to be bonded dollars, not checked dollars.
okay, well,
That's been the get from the very beginning.
But you got the bond before you even had the designs done, so, right, that was kind of like set up to crash to begin with, to me.
Well, not necessarily.
Well,
It should have been reviewed by the board.
it should have been,
And they
yeah,
could have looked at it at the time,
right,
and then gone ahead either yay or nay,
right.
or continue with understanding there may have been an overfunding need. But we didn't do that, we didn't have it.
So
You weren't given that opportunity.
No, we need to.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's lesson learned. I mean, you've got a bond, it's kind of like, okay, we got the bond, now we're gonna go ahead with this project, but nothing, and I mean, in the last 5 years, costs have gone up dramatically, and these things happen. I think the bottom line of this whole thing, I'm not surprised that there were additional funds needed, but I think that it was the element of the surprise of the amount at the time,
I think
I
that
ca-
if you're in
it's
this
kind
business, you're gonna be aware that there's gonna be some increases
Right,
in cost.
right.
It has to, that's just the way the life is.
Right.
However, if you don't know beforehand what the negatives are in that, then you can't there's no way to overcome it. Nothing to do, you can't cancel things, or you don't think you need the need of canceling or spending them next year instead of this year,
right,
which we didn't have. And I think that some of this, at least if we could have recognized that there was this problem coming in, we could have dealt with it, but not on the matter that it was complete. We heard about it after it was totally done. There was no advance notice on it that we are aware of.
How does an elected official meet his fiduciary responsibilities if information is withheld? Can't. Cannot do it. That's why we're here.
I'm not going with the information withheld thing. I don't think I think having not been here, this was, okay, I'm gonna use this one. A lot of this is BS. This is before Sherry, okay? So, but just, it seems that from an outside point from the get-go, I mean, we've gotta have a more solid footing on what the projects are gonna cost. We really need to consider what things are gonna be, you know, and I don't think costs are gonna go down, you know, better planning. I think now it's a lesson learned, it's done, thank God, the administration and the people involved we had the funds appropriated that we could use them, they were there. That's a biggie right there. I guess I kinda wanna use the term like Big Bird Cookie Monster. For example, if we're going to have a project that's gonna cost $3 million is what the budget's for. Okay, can we, Carol, I guess this is to you and Todd, to like, okay, if we get through, that's what it's gonna be, 3 mil, that's, okay? All right, so these invoices come in, and so we can see it's this project, there's 3 mil, and we had to pay out this much already, and this is how much we have left. Now, that way, I mean, that would keep us pretty well up to date, I mean, if you can look at it and say, okay, that's what we've got, and then, you know, as we go forward with that, then I think it'd be easier, then we can say, well, wait a minute, you know, we're almost done, we've got this, or, you know, we're looking a little short here, maybe we can take it from somewhere else. But I think it would be easier for some of us to read, or to follow, you know, to try to do that.
That's one of the things we've been talking about,
Yeah.
is the need to have that advance notice,
Right,
so that we can do the adjustments before they become a nail in the back
yeah,
of our
if
heads.
it looks like that it's getting short, then let's talk about it and see what we need to do just in case.
We didn't have the opportunity to go from Obama.
No.
Question. I mean, I'm trying to think figure out where we go from here. I think it's something that needs to be discussed, yes, but I had no qualms as far as thinking that there was misappropriation or fraud or anything else. It happened. Yes, somewhere along the line, we all should have been more proactive and in watching these things go down. But there were board people before some of us, and now we're here. So that's, you know, that's done. We've covered the costs. That was yesterday. Now we need to move forward because we know what happened.
But we don't want it to happen again.
Exactly. So
And
that's
that's
why.
what we're doing.
Right, so that's what we need to do, is focus on what we can do to not have this happen again.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I think in addition to looking at the numbers in a different way and referring back to the initial budget due, keep in mind where we are vis-a-vis where we started, that we need to look going forward at engineering costs, contingencies, inflation, all three of which were not part of the budget that we had set for this. So, I mean, we would have seen that we were way off or way ahead of the initial budget.
That's
But
exactly
we also-
the information we need
But we also,
to go ahead.
but we wouldn't have known exactly why unless we went back and until we went back and looked at the initial budget figures and we saw, as you said, we know how to put pipe in the ground. We're not so sure about estimating the cost on a reservoir or pumping station.
And they were all internal, that original budget was internally done, which was, you have a lot of great people, don't get me wrong, but if the bonded dollars were expected, and I'm not saying you know that better than I, you've been sitting in the room, was expected to complete the entire construction of phase one, then you probably needed a different budgeting or estimation technique at that time. That was more accurate, more specific, more in-depth, brought some consultants in that knew everything together. And it would have taken more time though. You also got, I mean, I gotta tell you, we were taking a look at your bond offering. It has been a lot of years since we saw you. You're paying $19 million for $22 million worth of bonds. You got 22, you got a huge premium at the time. So getting into the market when you did, I mean, there was a huge advantage to saying, hey, we're gonna put this together, we're gonna get there and get out there, because you got $3 million in premium that's free to your ratepayers. That's free money, you don't have to pay it back, right? So I think that consideration, I would guess, and I wasn't in the room at that time, but it, you know, it was a very, very advantageous bonding market.
Mhm.
So, you know, there's a lot of considerations to take into play, and I think that at the end of the day, honestly, if that original estimate, I'm gonna say pre-design estimate, because we don't have a good word for it, because it's called the same as everything else.
Design is a very.
Pre-design had been married up with the post-design, this would have fallen out incredibly quickly, right? But a lot of what you were reported on and approved by project was the post-design estimate. That's what you approved. And when you put that up in line with the actual cost, they're very consistent. You know, there's some ups and downs and overs, and there's reasons for it. You got a new bridge, you did this changed, the boulder was here. So things you expect in construction. But at the end of the day, it's very consistent and well done, because it was a very in-depth estimation technique. That's not what the pre-design phase was at, but to Dave's point, you know, I wasn't aware if that's what you felt. I mean, that's just something you need to learn for the future. Where are you gonna be in the design, going into the bonding markets? Just some considerations to throw out.
But we went in with design X, there were design changes. Design changes that this commissioner knew nothing about. Things that were brought in from study that we still had not approved. They increased pipe sizes, increased cost. Did nothing about it.
Well, and I'm not an engineer, will never be an engineer. Sorry, engineers. But I will say what the board did approve from a construction, if I could use my words, construction engineering, what you approved was put in front of you and is consistent with the dollars that are coming through today at the project level.
Thank you.
What do you consider an appropriate contingency fund?
Oh, good, well, I'm not an engineer.
Okay.
I just know, the only thing that's right, I'm an accountant.
Okay, sorry.
I've been in the business for 20 years, watching throughout the United States. What was kind of surprising with that is just the same contingency across all different project types. So generally, we would see a variation depending on risk or how well you know it, and again, you got $3 million free money when you went into the bonding markets.
Mhm.
I mean, it's great, that took you a long ways. So getting into the bonding markets was really important at that time, because those dollars were there for you.
Well, and you're exactly right about there should be different contingencies on different projects. I think the recommendations for reservoirs and pumping stations is closer to 85% than the 30% that we put in
On pre-design.
on pre-design. But that's not my area of expertise either. But is that approximately within an order of magnitude?
That lines up with what I shared with you at the February 20th work session.
Right, that's what I was thinking. So you hit that nail right on the head.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any questions?
I don't have it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Yeah.
No more questions? Okay. Well, thank you. We appreciate your work.
Thank you.
And we hope never to have to ask you to do this again.
Anything else?
Just to remind commissioners that I need, if you have not submitted it yet, I need your general manager evaluations by noon on the 16th, so I can summarize them, finish it. That's it.
Adjourned.